Let me tell you about the day the Galactic Assessment Center learned why humans should never be underestimated, and more importantly, why they should never, ever be given access to basic survival equipment and left unsupervised. The Galactic Assessment Center had been conducting their famous survival aptitude test for over 3 centuries. It was a simple concept, really. Take a representative from any species, drop them on testing moon Gamma 7, give them a standard survival kit, and see if they can build a basic shelter within 6 hours. Most species managed a lean-to if they were lucky. The Zephyrines usually gave up after 2 hours and spent the rest of the time meditating. The Crystalline Collective just stood there and vibrated ominously until pickup time. Professor Krenth had administered this test 2,847 times. He was a Valdorian, which meant he looked like a cross between a librarian and a very judgmental ostrich, complete with 4 arms that were perfect for taking notes and expressing disappointment simultaneously. He had seen every possible variation of failure, from the blobites who literally melted under pressure, to the warrior species who tried to intimidate the rocks into forming shelter. But today was different. Today, he had a human. Jake Martinez had been signed up for this test by his roommate, Zippy, a well-meaning Arcturian who thought it would be super educational for Jake to participate in interspecies academic programs. Zippy had filled out all the paperwork while Jake was at work, which was either the most thoughtful gesture in the galaxy or the setup for a cosmic practical joke. "So let me get this straight," Jake said, reading through the assessment guidelines, while sitting in the waiting area that looked like a dentist's office designed by someone who had only heard descriptions of Earth furniture. "You want me to build a shelter on a moon, with basic supplies, in 6 hours. Professor Krenth nodded all 4 of his arms simultaneously. "Correct. The test is designed to evaluate problem-solving capabilities under duress, resource management skills, and basic survival instincts. Most species achieve a rudimentary lean-to structure, which is considered a passing grade." Jake looked at the equipment list: emergency rations, water purification tablets, basic rope, a small knife, emergency beacon, thermal blanket, and assorted metal tools that looked like they were designed by a committee of engineers who had never actually held tools before. And the weather conditions? Harsh but survivable. -40°C, occasional windstorms, low atmospheric pressure, nothing you humans haven't encountered before, according to our records. Professor Krenth's assistant, Blixo, a nervous creature that resembled a caffeinated ferret with opposable thumbs, was busy setting up the monitoring equipment. The standard protocol was simple: observe, document, and try not to laugh when the test subject inevitably failed in a predictable manner. "Any questions before we begin?" Professor Krenth asked, his tone suggesting this was merely a formality. Jake stood up and stretched, looking every bit like a guy who was about to spend a weekend doing yard work instead of fighting for survival on an alien moon. "Yeah, actually. Are there any restrictions on what I can build?" Blixo and Professor Krenth exchanged glances. In 2,847 tests, nobody had ever asked about restrictions. Most species were too busy panicking about the basic requirements. "Well, no," Professor Krenth said slowly. "The parameters simply state you must construct adequate shelter for survival. There are no upper limits specified." Jake grinned, and something in that expression should have been the first warning sign. It was the kind of grin that suggested Jake had just realized he was about to have way more fun than anyone had planned. "Perfect. Let's do this thing." Testing Moon Gamma 7 was about as hospitable as a freezer full of broken glass. The landscape looked like someone had taken Mars, painted it gray, and then beaten it with a cosmic sledgehammer for good measure. Rocky outcroppings jutted up like the universe's idea of modern art, and the wind howled with the enthusiasm of a banshee having a particularly bad day. Jake materialized on the surface via transport beam, along with his survival kit and 3 other test subjects who had the misfortune of being scheduled for the same session. There was Glorthok, a hulking Brontesian who looked like he could bench press a small planet but was currently eyeing the rocks with the confusion of someone trying to solve calculus with a crayon. Next to him stood Whisper of Rain, a delicate Etherian whose species was known for their philosophical insights and complete inability to handle anything resembling physical labor. The third contestant was Clank, a mechanical being from the Servo Collective who technically didn't need shelter, but participated in these tests for reasons that probably made sense to robots. Professor Krenth's voice crackled through the communication devices they'd all been given. "Test subjects, you have 6 hours, beginning now. Please proceed with standard shelter construction." Glorthok immediately began gathering rocks with the methodical determination of someone following an instruction manual written in a language he didn't quite understand. Whisper of Rain started arranging small stones in what might have been either a foundation or a Zen garden. Clank just stood there, calculating optimal angles while making soft beeping noises. And Jake? Jake was walking. Not gathering materials, not starting construction, just walking around the entire testing area like he was conducting a property survey. He had pulled out what looked like a piece of string and was measuring distances between various rock formations, occasionally making notes on his palm with a piece of charcoal he'd somehow extracted from his emergency kit. Back in the monitoring station, Blixo was updating his observation log. Standard behavior patterns observed. Brontesian subject displaying typical confusion regarding tool usage. Etherian subject has begun philosophical contemplation of mineral composition. Servo unit calculating, as expected. And the human? Professor Krent asked, though he was watching the screens with growing puzzlement. Well, sir, he appears to be exploring. He's covered approximately 2/3 of the testing area and has made 17 separate measurements. This was unusual. Most species either panicked immediately or began gathering materials in a frantic, disorganized manner. The few successful candidates typically found a nice rock face and started building a simple lean-to against it. None of them had ever treated the first hour like they were conducting a geological survey. Jake had now completed his circuit and was standing at what appeared to be the exact center of the testing area. He knelt down, cleared away some loose rocks, and began digging. Not the desperate scrabbling that usually characterized shelter-building attempts, but methodical excavation, like someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Professor," Blixo said, his voice taking on that particular tone that suggested he was seeing something that didn't fit into any of his pre-written observation categories. "The human appears to be digging a foundation." "A what?" "A foundation, sir. You know, the structural base that supports a building. He's creating a rectangular excavation approximately 3 meters by 4 meters. Professor Krent stared at the monitor. In 2,847 tests, the word foundation had never once appeared in his reports. Most species were thrilled if they managed to stack rocks without them falling over. Meanwhile, Jake had moved on to phase 2 of whatever master plan was unfolding in his head. He'd opened his emergency rations and was doing something to them that definitely wasn't eating. Instead, he appeared to be mixing them with water and some kind of powder he'd scraped from the rocks themselves. "Blixo," Professor Krent said slowly. "What exactly is the human doing with his food?" Blixo adjusted the camera for a closer look. "I believe, sir, he's making concrete." The silence in the monitoring station was deafening. On the screens, Glarthok was still trying to figure out how rope worked. Whisper of Rain had achieved a state of meditative oneness with a pile of pebbles, and Clank had calculated himself into a recursive loop. But the human was laying the foundation for what was beginning to look less like a shelter, and more like the beginning of a small building project. Professor Krent realized he might need to call his supervisor. 2 hours into the test, Professor Krent was experiencing what humans might call an existential crisis, though Valdorians typically express this through increasingly frantic note-taking and the nervous ruffling of neck feathers. The other test subjects were performing exactly as expected. Glorthak had managed to create something that might generously be called a lean-to if you squinted, and had very low standards for structural integrity. Whisper of Rain had transcended the need for physical shelter, and was now composing what sounded like interpretive poetry about the philosophical implications of wind resistance. Clank had successfully calculated 47,000 different shelter configurations, and was paralyzed by the abundance of choices. Jake, meanwhile, had somehow turned his section of testing Moon Gamma 7 into what could only be described as a construction site. The foundation he'd laid was now curing in the alien sun, and he'd moved on to phase 2 of his mysterious project. "Blixo," Professor Krent said, his voice climbing to frequencies that made nearby equipment hum in sympathy. "Please explain to me how the human has acquired approximately 6 times the building materials that were provided in his kit." Blixo consulted his instruments and then double-checked them, hoping they were malfunctioning. "Well, sir, it appears he's been borrowing." "Borrowing?" "From the other contestants, sir. When Glorthak's first shelter attempt collapsed, the human asked if he could help clean up the debris. He's now incorporated those rocks into what appears to be a load-bearing wall system. Similarly, when Whisper of Rain achieved spiritual enlightenment and abandoned her material construction, the human politely requested permission to repurpose her materials." Professor Krent watched in horrified fascination as Jake approached Clank, who was still frozen in computational paralysis. Jake seemed to be having a friendly conversation with the robot, gesturing toward his growing structure and making what appeared to be helpful suggestions. "And now?" Professor Krenth asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "The human has convinced Clank that the most efficient shelter solution is collaborative construction. Clank is now providing engineering calculations and precision tool work in exchange for, I believe the human called it subcontracting opportunities, in the expanding galactic construction market." This was unprecedented. The survival aptitude test was designed to be an individual assessment. The idea that someone might turn it into a cooperative venture had never occurred to the test designers, mostly because it had never occurred to any species in the history of the galaxy. Most civilizations viewed survival situations as every being for themselves, not as networking opportunities. Jake had now begun what appeared to be the vertical construction phase of his project. Using a pulley system he'd improvised from rope and some kind of lever mechanism built around the largest rock outcropping, he was hoisting materials up to create what was unmistakably a second level. "A second level," Professor Krenth repeated, as if saying it out loud might make it make sense. "He's building a second level." "Yes, sir. And if I'm reading these measurements correctly, he's incorporating defensive positions." "Defensive positions. Those aren't windows, sir. Those are arrow slits. And that raised section on the eastern wall would provide excellent coverage for ranged attacks." Professor Krenth stared at the monitor. The test was supposed to evaluate basic survival skills. Instead, the human appeared to be constructing what military historians might recognize as a fortified position suitable for withstanding a siege. This was either the most spectacular success in the history of the survival aptitude test, or the most spectacular failure to understand the assignment. The worst part was that Jake looked like he was enjoying himself. While other species typically spent the test in various states of panic, confusion, or existential dread, the human was whistling, actually whistling, like he was having the kind of fun that people had when they got to play with power tools on weekends. "Professor," Blixo said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering news that nobody wanted to hear, "I think we might have a problem." "Just one problem?" "Well, no, sir. Several problems. First, the structure he's building appears to exceed the structural engineering capabilities of most galactic civilizations. Second, he somehow created what appears to be a rudimentary ventilation system, using principles I don't recognize. And third," Blexo paused, checking his readings again. "Third, sir, I believe he's building a chimney. And where there's a chimney, there's usually—" They both looked at the monitor just in time to see Jake testing what was unmistakably a heating system he'd constructed from materials that were definitely not in the standard survival kit. Professor Krenth reached for his emergency communication device. This was definitely a call your supervisor situation. What happened next would eventually become case study number 1 in the revised Galactic Assessment Center manual, under the section titled Why Humans Should Never Be Left Unsupervised with Basic Chemistry Sets. Jake had disappeared inside his increasingly fortress-like structure for approximately 27 minutes. Professor Krenth spent those 27 minutes pacing in small circles, while Blixo frantically updated observation logs that were beginning to read less like scientific documentation and more like the fever dreams of someone who'd eaten too much fermented quibble fruit. When Jake emerged, he was carrying what appeared to be a jury-rigged apparatus constructed from the water purification system, several metal components from the emergency beacon, and what looked suspiciously like the heating coils from the thermal regulation unit that was supposed to keep test subjects from freezing to death. "Blixo," Professor Krenth said with the careful tone of someone trying very hard not to have a complete nervous breakdown, "please tell me the human has not just dismantled critical life support equipment to build some kind of weapon." Blixo adjusted the monitoring sensors and zoomed in for a closer look. The device Jake was assembling had multiple chambers, a series of tubes that defied several laws of physics, and a collection mechanism that looked like it belonged in a laboratory rather than a survival situation. "I don't think it's a weapon, sir." "Then what is it?" "Well, based on the configuration and the fact that he's now adding what appears to be ground-up emergency rations to one of the chambers, I believe he's built a coffee machine." The silence in the monitoring station was so complete that they could hear the hum of equipment 3 rooms away. Professor Krenth's forearms hung motionless at his sides as his brain attempted to process information that simply did not fit into any known category of rational behavior. "A coffee machine," he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir. He's created a chemical heating system using the water purification tablets as a catalyst, rigged a pressure system from the emergency beacon's power source, and fashioned what appears to be a filtration system from components I can't even identify. And now he's... oh much. He's actually brewing coffee, sir. I can detect the thermal signature of heated liquid, and there's definitely an aroma being produced. On the monitor, Jake was indeed operating his makeshift brewing system with the casual confidence of someone who had just solved one of life's essential problems. Steam was rising from various parts of the apparatus. There were several satisfied beeping noises suggesting that whatever he'd done to the electronics was working as intended. And Jake himself was standing there with the expression of a man who was about to have his first cup of coffee in several hours. "This is impossible," Professor Krenth muttered. "The test parameters specifically provide only basic survival necessities. There is no scenario in which coffee preparation should be achievable with the provided materials." "And yet," Blixo pointed out with the helpfulness of someone stating the obvious, "there it is." Jake took a sip from what appeared to be a metal cup fashioned from part of the emergency kit's container. His expression suggested satisfaction, like someone who had just solved a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. Then he did something that would be talked about in xenoanthropology circles for decades to come. He took a break. Not the kind of break that exhausted test subjects usually took, where they collapsed in despair and contemplated the futility of existence. Jake pulled up what appeared to be a makeshift chair he'd constructed from surplus materials, positioned it in what was clearly the most scenic spot on his fortress's newly completed observation deck, and sat down to enjoy his coffee while admiring his work. Meanwhile, his construction project continued without him. "Professor," Blixo said, his voice reaching frequencies that suggested his species' equivalent of hysteria, "the fortress appears to be building itself." This was, unfortunately, accurate. Jake had apparently set up some kind of automated system using pulleys, counterweights, and what looked like a series of timed releases that continued moving materials and assembling structural components even while he was on his coffee break. It was like watching a Rube Goldberg machine designed by someone with an engineering degree and a complete disregard for the basic principles of survival psychology. "How is this possible?" Professor Krenth demanded. "I believe, sir, that while we were focused on the coffee machine, the human was simultaneously completing what appears to be a comprehensive automation system. He's essentially turned the construction process into a self-perpetuating mechanical operation." On the screen, Jake finished his coffee, stood up and stretched like someone who had just enjoyed a pleasant intermission. Then he walked over to check on his automated systems, made a few minor adjustments that somehow improved their efficiency, and started what appeared to be Phase 3 of his mysterious master plan. The other test subjects had, by this point, completely abandoned any pretense of individual survival efforts. Glorthak was standing at the edge of Jake's construction site with the expression of someone watching magic happen. Whisper of Rain had achieved a new level of philosophical enlightenment that seemed to involve a lot of gesturing at Jake's fortress and making sounds that probably meant "how the hell" in her native language. Even Clank had stopped calculating and was simply observing with what might have been robotic admiration. "Sir," Blixo said, consulting his chronometer, "we're only 3 hours into a 6-hour test." Professor Krenth looked at the monitor, where Jake was now doing something that involved advanced metallurgy and what appeared to be the beginnings of a communications array, and realized that calling his supervisor was no longer sufficient. He was going to have to call the Department of Impossible Things. The 6-hour timer had expired with all the fanfare of a cosmic joke. Professor Krenth materialized on testing Moon Gamma 7's surface via transport beam, clutching his evaluation tablet and what remained of his professional dignity. Standard protocol required him to conduct individual assessments of each contestant's shelter, rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 for structural integrity and survival viability, and file a report that his supervisors could read without questioning his mental competency. He had prepared himself for the usual collection of marginally functional lean-tos and creative interpretations of the word shelter. What he had not prepared himself for was stepping out of the transport beam and immediately being challenged by what appeared to be a security checkpoint. "Halt," announced a mechanical voice that sounded suspiciously like Clank. "Please state your name, purpose, and preferred beverage selection for your visit to Fort Martinez." Professor Krenth stared at what had once been Testing Area Gamma 7 and was now, apparently, Fort Martinez. The modest rocky outcropping that had served as the backdrop for 2,847 previous survival tests was now completely obscured by a multi-level fortified structure that looked like it had been designed by someone who took medieval castle architecture as a personal challenge rather than historical reference. "Average selection?" Professor Krenth managed to croak. "The commanding officer maintains a comprehensive beverage service," Clank explained from his position at what was unmistakably a guard station complete with a retractable barrier system. "Current options include coffee, herbal tea blend, and something called survival cocoa that appears to have been synthesized from emergency rations and what I can only describe as advanced chemistry. This was not in the manual. Professor Krenth had memorized the entire survival aptitude test evaluation protocol, and nowhere in its 847 pages did it mention anything about commanding officers, guard stations, or beverage services. He consulted his tablet, hoping to find some kind of guidance for this situation, but the evaluation form simply asked him to rate structural adequacy on a scale of 1 to 10. There wasn't even a box for completely redefines the concept of shelter. "I'll just have coffee, I suppose," Professor Krenth said, because when faced with the impossible, sometimes the only rational response is to play along and hope it makes sense eventually. Planck processed this request with a series of satisfied beeping noises and activated the barrier system. "Excellent choice. Please proceed to the main entrance. The commanding officer is currently conducting a structural tour for the other assessment candidates." The main entrance turned out to be an impressive archway flanked by defensive positions that would have made medieval military engineers weep with envy. As Professor Krenth approached, he could hear voices from inside the structure, and one of them was definitely Jake's, speaking in the tone of someone giving a guided tour. "Now, if you'll notice the ventilation system here, I've created a natural airflow pattern that maintains optimal temperature throughout the structure while providing multiple emergency exit routes. The beauty of this design is that it's completely sustainable, using only geothermal principles and basic atmospheric pressure differentials." Professor Krenth entered what could only be described as the main hall of a fortress, and discovered Jake addressing an audience consisting of Glorthok, Whisper of Rain, and what appeared to be several additional aliens who definitely had not been part of the original test group. "Professor Krenth," Jake called out with the cheerful enthusiasm of someone hosting a housewarming party. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining the water reclamation system. Would you like the full technical tour, or should we skip straight to the communications array?" "Communications array," Professor Krenth repeated, his voice climbing toward frequencies that made nearby crystal formations resonate. "Oh, absolutely. I managed to boost the signal from the emergency beacon by about 400% using a combination of metallic resonance chambers and some really creative antenna positioning. I've actually been in contact with 3 different trade routes that pass through this system. Turns out there's a surprising amount of commercial traffic through the Gamma sector." Professor Krenth looked around what Jake was casually calling the main hall and realized he was standing in a space that was larger, more comfortable, and significantly better appointed than his own office back at the assessment center. The walls were lined with what appeared to be storage systems, work areas, and what could only be described as amenities. There was even ambient lighting that seemed to be coming from some kind of reflective system that channeled natural sunlight throughout the interior spaces. "Jake," Professor Krenth said carefully, "the test was to build a basic shelter for survival." "Right," Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Mission accomplished. This place could comfortably house 12 people for about 6 months, assuming standard caloric requirements and moderate resource consumption. The defensive capabilities alone would deter most hostile wildlife, and the communications system means we're never really isolated from potential rescue operations. But it's a fortress." "Well, yes, technically it's a fortress. But it's a very practical fortress. Look, I installed cup holders." And indeed, there were cup holders, carefully carved into what appeared to be a custom-designed seating area that faced a large opening that provided an excellent view of the surrounding landscape, while remaining completely protected from the elements. "The coffee machine," Professor Krenth said weakly. "Where is the coffee machine?" Jake's face lit up with the pride of someone showing off their favorite hobby project. "Oh, you're gonna love this. I've actually upgraded the whole system. Come on, let me show you the kitchen." The kitchen. There was a kitchen, in a survival shelter, on a barren testing moon, and it was nicer than the food preparation area in the assessment center's staff quarters. Jake demonstrated his upgraded brewing system, which had somehow evolved from the jury-rigged apparatus Professor Krenth had witnessed earlier into something that looked like it belonged in a high-end cafe. The coffee was, Professor Krenth had to admit, excellent. "The really clever part," Jake continued, apparently unaware that he had fundamentally broken every assumption about survival psychology that the Galactic Assessment Center had operated under for 3 centuries, was realizing that all the basic components for advanced manufacturing were right there in the standard kit. You just had to think about it in terms of molecular chemistry rather than individual tools. Professor Krenth sat in his perfectly engineered cup-holder-quipped seat, drinking impossibly good coffee, and stared out through climate-controlled openings at a landscape that had been transformed from a harsh survival environment into what appeared to be the courtyard of a thriving settlement. "Jake," he said finally. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this structure for survival adequacy? Jake considered the question seriously. Well, I'd probably give it a 7, maybe 7.5. 7. Professor Krent's voice cracked. This fortress rates a 7? Sure. I mean, it gets the job done, but there's definitely room for improvement. If I'd had another few hours, I could have installed proper plumbing and maybe a basic manufacturing facility. As it stands, it's really just a temporary solution. Professor Krent realized that he was going to have to completely rewrite the evaluation manual. 3 weeks later, Professor Krent was still trying to write his report. He had gone through 17 different drafts, each one sounding progressively more like the manifesto of someone who had spent too much time staring into the cosmic void and had started staring back. His supervisor, Director Vorthak, had initially refused to believe the preliminary findings and had insisted on conducting a personal site inspection. Director Vorthak had returned from testing Moon Gamma-7 with the shell-shocked expression of someone who had witnessed the fundamental laws of physics filing a formal complaint with the universe's management. So, Director Vorthak said, settling into his office chair with the careful movements of someone whose worldview had been recently demolished and hastily reconstructed using duct tape and stubborn denial. The human is still there. Yes, sir. Jake has established what he calls permanent residency, pending proper zoning approval. He submitted a formal application to the Galactic Commerce Authority to register Fort Martinez as an independent trading post. And the application is being seriously considered. Yes, sir. Apparently his location provides optimal access to 3 major shipping lanes, his facilities exceed galactic standards for safety and accommodation, and his coffee has been rated as surprisingly excellent by the Trade Route Inspection Committee. Professor Krent consulted his notes, which had evolved from standard evaluation forms into what resembled the operational manual for a small municipality. He's also established what he calls a guest services program for travelers. The Crystalline Collective has already booked Fort Martinez for their annual philosophical retreat. Director Vorthak made a noise that might have been laughter or the sound of his remaining sanity attempting to escape through his respiratory system. Let me understand this correctly. A human took our standard survival test, built a fortress instead of a lean-to, established trade relationships with 3 different civilizations, and is now running what amounts to a luxury hotel on our testing moon. That's correct, sir. He's also offered to provide consulting services for our survival test program. According to his proposal, he believes he can improve the overall success rate by approximately 400% through what he calls practical resource management education. And what do you think of this proposal? Professor Krent had spent considerable time thinking about this question. His initial response had involved a lot of nervous feather ruffling and several attempts to find loopholes in the basic laws of physics. But after 3 weeks of reviewing the data, consulting with engineering specialists, and drinking more of Jake's impossibly good coffee than was probably healthy for a Valdorian, he had reached a conclusion that surprised even him. I think, sir, that we have been conducting this test incorrectly for the past 3 centuries. Director Vorthak's expression suggested that this was not the answer he had been hoping for, but possibly the one he had been expecting. Every species we have tested has approached the survival challenge from the perspective of, what is the minimum I need to do to not die, Professor Krent continued. The human approach it from the perspective of, how can I use these resources to thrive? We have been testing for survival. He demonstrated mastery. But he built a fortress. Yes, sir. A very practical fortress, with excellent amenities and impressive structural engineering. When I asked him about his thought process, he said, and I quote, "Well, if you're going to build something, you might as well build it right. This was just like that weekend camping trip in Montana, but with worse weather and better materials." Director Vorthak was quiet for a long time, staring out his office window at the distant stars, and probably contemplating the implications of living in a universe where humans considered advanced fortress construction to be equivalent to weekend camping. Professor Krent, he said finally, what would you rate the human's performance on our standard evaluation scale? Professor Krent had been dreading this question, because the honest answer was going to sound like the kind of thing that got evaluation officers transferred to remote monitoring stations in sectors where the most exciting event was the annual migration of cosmic dust particles. Well, sir, technically our scale only goes up to 10. And the human's performance would require us to add several new categories to the evaluation system, possibly an entirely new mathematical framework. Director Vorthak made another noise that definitely sounded like escaping sanity. What categories? resource optimization, infrastructure development, economic integration, diplomatic relations, technological innovation, and what Jake refers to as hospitality excellence. Also, we would need to create a subcategory for beverage service quality. Beverage service quality. His coffee really is remarkably good, sir. There was another long silence. Finally, Director Vorthak reached a decision that would fundamentally alter the Galactic Assessment Center's approach to survival evaluation. Professor Krenth, I want you to prepare a comprehensive report recommending the complete overhaul of our testing protocols. I also want you to formally invite Jake Martinez to serve as a consultant on our new program development. And Fort Martinez, sir? Fort Martinez will be designated as the new Advanced Survival Training Facility. Apparently, we need to raise our standards. Professor Krenth made notes about program restructuring, consultant agreements, and facility redesignation. Then he added one final note to his report, because some things needed to be documented for the sake of future xenoanthropologists who might try to understand this moment in galactic history. Personal observation, he wrote. Human beings, when presented with a survival challenge, do not merely survive, they renovate. This appears to be a species-wide characteristic, and should be considered in all future interactions with human subjects. Also, they take their coffee very seriously, and this should never be underestimated. 3 months later, the Galactic Assessment Center's new Advanced Survival Training Program had a waiting list of over 3,000 applicants from 847 different species. Fort Martinez had been expanded twice to accommodate demand, featured a 5-star rating from the Galactic Hospitality Guide, and had become the unofficial headquarters for interspecies resource management education. Jake Martinez was still there, still building improvements, still serving excellent coffee, and still treating the entire operation like it was just another weekend project that had gotten slightly out of hand. Because that's what humans do. They don't just solve problems. They over-engineer solutions that work so well they accidentally revolutionize entire industries while making sure everyone has a really good cup of coffee in the process. And somewhere in the galaxy, other species were finally beginning to understand why you should never, ever underestimate a human with basic supplies and too much time on their hands.